Every morning in our house began the same way. Brown would leave for work early, barely noticing me, with a quick kiss on the cheek that felt more like a ritual than an expression of affection. I would stay behind, watching through the window as he drove away, slowly realizing that my life had turned into a series of predictable moments that left me feeling cold inside. Brown and I have been married for 8 years. I remember how in the beginning our relationship was full of passion and spontaneity. We could go for a walk in the middle of the night or have a romantic dinner for no reason at all. But over time, that fire faded, giving way to a routine I didn't know how to escape. It scared me how we were gradually turning into people who just shared a roof, but not a life. Recently, over a cup of coffee, my friend Lena told me that she and her husband had decided to divorce. I sat there listening to her, trying to imagine how I would feel in her place. The conversation left me with a vague sense of unease, as if something inside me had suddenly shifted, and I realized that I was more afraid of the end than I was willing to admit. What if our relationship with Brown was also standing on the edge of a cliff, and I was just refusing to see it? Brown suggested that I join him on his business conference trip to New York. It could be a good chance for us to spend some time together, he said, and I agreed. Though deep down, I had my doubts. Perhaps this trip would help us rekindle what we once had. I wanted to believe that we could still find each other, despite the insurmountable changes that had taken place in our lives over the years. During the drive to New York, I gazed out the car window, trying not to think about Lena and her divorce. Brown was silent, focused on the road, and it seemed to me that this silence between us was louder than any words. We were close, yet so far apart at the same time. Upon arriving at the hotel, I felt that things weren't going as I had hoped. Instead of feeling close to Brown, I found myself alone in a luxurious room overlooking the bustling city. Brown left immediately for his meeting, leaving me in this empty, unfamiliar space. I walked to the window and stared at the twinkling lights of the city that never sleeps, thinking about how long it had been since I truly felt alive. I thought about what we had lost. Somewhere deep inside, a vague sense of anxiety began to grow, as if I were standing on the brink of something inevitable, something that would change my life forever. Perhaps I was just afraid of the moment when I would have to face the truth and admit that our relationship would never be the same. At that time, I had no idea that meeting Taylor would force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about myself, about Brown, about love, but that feeling, the sense of impending change, had already taken hold of me. All I could do was wait, trying to understand what had gone wrong, and whether we still had a chance to make things right. The next day, the conference began, and I struggled to keep my attention on the presentations, which dragged on one after another. My thoughts were occupied by my own turmoil, which refused to settle. I was torn between despair and hope, desperately trying to figure out how to restore the connection that once united Brown and me. After lunch, we ran into Taylor. I had seen him only a couple of times before, an old friend of Nut Brown's with whom he had lost touch. Taylor was the kind of man who could instantly win people over with his charm and confidence. They exchanged brief memories, and I noticed that for the first time in a long while, Brown smiled sincerely, as if he had momentarily returned to the past. When Taylor turned his attention to me, I felt something inside me stir. He looked into my eyes with such interest, as if he could see right through me, and it made me blush a little. I wasn't used to that kind of attention, especially after many years of quiet existence with Brown. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about Taylor, his gaze, and that strange spark I felt in his presence. Late that evening, after the official dinner, Taylor suggested we step out onto the balcony to get some fresh air. Brown had left earlier, citing fatigue, and I felt that I couldn't refuse. We stepped out onto the balcony, which offered a stunning view of the lights of New York. The city looked like an endless sea of light, where each life burned with its own small flame. We stood side by side, silently admiring the view, and I suddenly realized how long it had been since I felt this alive. Our conversations that evening had grown increasingly personal, and I ended up telling him more than I ever expected to. I spoke about feeling lost, about how my life had turned into a routine. Taylor listened attentively, without interrupting, and I felt a sense of relief that someone finally heard me. And then he did something I could never have anticipated. In one moment, Taylor turned to me, and before I could say anything, he leaned in and gently kissed me. The kiss was light, barely perceptible, but it held so much warmth and understanding that it made my head spin. It was something completely different from what I was used to with Brown. There was no passion or desire in this kiss, only warmth and a strange feeling that he understood me better than I understood myself. I pulled away, stunned and confused. Inside me, everything was a whirlwind of emotions. The joy that someone had once again awakened feelings in me, and the horror that I had allowed it to happen. I tried to find words to explain that this was a mistake, that it shouldn't have happened, but Taylor just smiled, softly, and said he didn't regret what he had done. When I returned to the room, Brown was already asleep. I lay down beside him, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the gap, feeling that this kiss had changed everything. Taylor had stirred something in me that I had long buried under the weight of everyday life. I lay in the darkness, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, and realized that nothing would ever be the same. That kiss had opened a door to a world I was afraid to explore. And now that the door was open, I couldn't bring myself to close it. The next morning brought with it a heaviness that I couldn't shake off. I tried to behave as usual, but inside, everything was in turmoil. Brown noticed my nervousness and asked several times if everything was okay. I answered affirmatively, but I could hear how unnatural my voice sounded. My thoughts kept drifting back to that moment on the balcony, to that kiss that seemed to have awakened something in me I thought was long dead. I tried to convince myself that it was just a moment of weakness, that I could forget about it and continue living as before. But every time I closed my eyes, Taylor's image appeared before me, his gaze, in which I saw both understanding and challenge. I felt my feelings for him growing stronger, despite all my efforts to push them away. Brown noticed that something was different about me. He began asking more questions, becoming more attentive. But instead of bringing me comfort, his attention only heightened my anxiety. I tried to hide my feelings, but they followed me like a shadow, reflected in every gesture and word. Deep down, I knew that if I didn't deal with this now, things would only get worse. At the conference, I tried to avoid Taylor. I stayed close to other participants, keeping myself busy with conversations and presentations. But every time I saw him in the crowd, my heart would start racing. It seemed to me that he looked at me in a way no one else ever had, and that look drew me in like a magnet. In the evening, as Brown and I had dinner at a restaurant with other conference participants, I felt Taylor's presence long before he approached our table. He joined us, and I noticed how tense Brown became, watching my every move. With each word, each gesture, I felt the invisible chasm between Brown and me growing wider. He tried to be friendly, but his smile was strained, and I knew he sensed that something was wrong. When Taylor spoke to me, I responded coldly, trying not to show how excited I was, but it felt like everyone around could see my trembling hands, see how hard I was trying to maintain my composure. We exchanged a few polite phrases, and the whole time I could feel Brown's gaze on me, sharp as a knife. At that moment, I realized that hiding the truth was no longer an option. Our relationship was no longer what it appeared to be. And if I didn't stop now, everything would spiral out of control. But the problem was, I didn't know how to stop it. I felt everything around me collapsing. And I understood that soon I would have to face the consequences of my actions. When dinner ended and Brown and I returned to our room, the silence between us was almost palpable. He didn't ask me any questions, but his eyes spoke more than words. I knew he could sense that I was drifting away from him, and that scared him. But what scared me was the realization that I was already beginning to lose control of my emotions, and that this path might lead me to something I couldn't predict. The next day, Taylor unexpectedly suggested that we visit a contemporary art exhibition being held near the hotel. I hesitated, knowing that any interaction with him could only complicate my life further. But curiosity and a desire to understand my feelings proved stronger than common sense. I agreed, justifying it by telling myself that it would be a brief distraction from the tense atmosphere of the conference. We met in the hotel lobby and headed to the exhibition. On the way, I tried not to think about the previous evening and about the fact that Brown had probably suspected something. But even that couldn't completely silence the excitement I felt about the upcoming meeting with Taylor. I knew we were walking on very thin ice, and any careless step could lead to disaster. The exhibition turned out to be unexpectedly interesting. We wandered through the halls, discussing the artist's works, and I realized that it was easy to be with Taylor. He listened attentively, asked questions that made me think, and suddenly I realized that it had been a long time since I felt so alive and engaged in a conversation. Everything with him felt simple and natural, as if we had known each other for years. After the exhibition, Taylor suggested we stop by a small bar nearby for a refreshing drink. I hesitated again, but curiosity and something more, something I couldn't yet admit, pushed me to agree. The bar was cozy with soft lighting and quiet music. We took a table in the corner and the conversation continued. Taylor asked me about my life, about what I loved, what I dreamed of doing. I answered honestly, though. Deep down, I knew I was opening up to him too much, that this was no longer just a friendly conversation. The atmosphere between us was becoming increasingly intimate. Taylor looked at me as if he were trying to decipher my deepest thoughts. And at some point, I realized that I could no longer resist what I was feeling. We both knew what was happening, but neither of us wanted to stop. When we left the bar, it was already getting dark outside. I paused for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, but Taylor came closer, and I could feel his warmth. He took my hand, and I didn't pull away. It felt like madness, knowing I was walking down a path that could destroy everything, but not having the strength to turn back. Taylor looked into my eyes, and at that moment, there was nothing left between us but that gaze. He leaned in, and his lips met mine. This kiss was different from that first. It was filled with more passion, more desire, but also with more inner conflict. I felt a storm brewing inside me, guilt toward Brown, and an irresistible attraction to Taylor. This kiss was not just an expression of our feelings. It was a moment when all my doubts and fears converged. I knew I was doing something wrong, but I couldn't stop. In this kiss, there was everything I wanted to say, but couldn't put into words. When the kiss ended, we both stood in silence, trying to catch our breath. I felt that there was now something more between us than just a fleeting moment. But along with that realization came the understanding that I was going too far, that this kiss might be the point of no return. I pulled my hand away from his, realizing that this couldn't continue. "I need to go," I whispered, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Taylor didn't say anything. He just looked at me with the same gaze, full of understanding and pain, and it was unbearable. I walked away, leaving him there on the dark street, but my heart remained with him. As I returned to the hotel, I knew I had taken the first step in a direction from which there would be no easy return. The next few days passed in a sort of fog, as if I were trying to convince myself that everything could still return to the way it was. I avoided Taylor, even though his presence haunted me everywhere. Even when we didn't cross paths at the conference, I felt his gaze on me, heard his voice in my head. Every moment spent with Brown was a painful reminder that I was teetering on the edge of disaster. Brown was becoming increasingly tense. He noticed my absence, my distracted looks, and the unspoken words in my responses. Our conversations had turned into short phrases filled with suspicion and hidden anger. I could see him struggling to understand what was happening, and I dreaded the moment when he would finally gather the courage to ask the big question. That moment came on the last evening of the conference. We returned to our room, and I immediately sensed that something had changed. Brown sat silently on the edge of the bed, his head down, looking as if everything inside him had been torn apart. I knew he had figured something out, and the realization made me unbearably afraid. "Samantha," he began quietly, not lifting his head. "What's happening between us? Can you tell me the truth?" His voice was full of pain and exhaustion, and I realized that I could no longer avoid it. No matter how much I tried to hide behind lies, the truth would still come out. I sank into the chair opposite him, feeling my insides clenched with fear and guilt. I started, but the words caught in my throat. "Brown, I don't know how to explain it. I feel like we've lost each other. Everything has become so empty, and I'm confused." He lifted his eyes to me, full of tears and anger, and in that moment, I knew I could no longer hide the truth. "It's because of Taylor, isn't it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I've seen the way you look at him." "Samantha, I didn't want to believe it, but I'm not blind. His words cut through me, and I felt the tears begin to well up in my eyes. I couldn't deny or confirm his suspicions. It was all too obvious. Silence hung between us, heavier than any words. "Are you cheating on me with him?" he finally asked, a note of desperation in his voice. No, I managed to say, "I haven't cheated on you, physically. But emotionally, I can't deny that. Something has happened. I'm confused about my feelings, and I don't know how to stop it." Brown sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall in front of him. I could see him trying to process what he'd just heard, battling with his anger and pain. "We've been together for so many years, Samantha," he finally said. "I never thought we'd end up here, but if you've already left me emotionally, then what's left? You see it yourself. There's nothing left of us, just an empty shell." I wanted to argue, to say that we could still save our relationship, but I knew that would be a lie. We both understood that things had gone too far. "I don't see another way," Brown said, his voice dead, as if he were speaking through clenched teeth. "I don't want to continue this anymore. I think we should get a divorce." Those words hit me like a blow. I knew this was where things were headed, but hearing it from him was unbearable. I sat there stunned, unable to respond. "If you want to be with Taylor, go to him," he added. "I won't stand in your way. I just want this to end." When Brown walked out of the room, I felt something inside me collapse. I was left alone, surrounded by silence, and realized that I had destroyed everything that had been important to me. At that moment, Taylor called. I heard his voice full of concern and didn't know what to say. He suggested we meet, talk, discuss the future, but I was no longer sure that we had any future at all. All I felt was emptiness and fear of what I had done. "I don't know, Taylor," I replied quietly. "Everything's out of control. Brown wants a divorce. I don't know what to do." "Leave with me," Taylor said. "Come with me, Samantha. We can start over without these painful memories." His words were full of confidence, but I couldn't share his enthusiasm. I felt that this wasn't a solution, but an escape, and I was no longer sure that running away was what I wanted. "Give me time to think," I asked, feeling fear tightening its grip on me again. After that call, I sat in complete darkness, realizing that I was standing on the brink of the unknown. My world had collapsed, and now I had only two paths, one leading into the unknown with Taylor, and the other into loneliness and regret for what I had done.